Today we're going to do Candide by Voltaire. This is a relatively short novel of the 18th century, 1759. At my school I teach French, and every year, for the past 4 or 5 years maybe, for my French 3 and 4 students, we read Candide. This is kind of a boast, but it shouldn't be, because really I know I'm not a good language teacher. That is, I don't use a textbook. I'm not very systematic, and I'm impatient with the first year students. I'm in a hurry to get them to Candide. A French 3 student is not ready for Candide, but if I have a French 4 student, that's 4th year, well, they have to do Candide, and I've decided 3rd or 4th Candide. It is a great piece of literature. It has its flaws, but it, in my opinion, has a truth that is profound. It profoundly has affected me, and I like to say that Voltaire stumbled onto truth. I think it's true, because excuse me, although he wrote a lot, he didn't write anything even closely important, anything nearly as important as Candide. And you'll see why, I think. I owe my understanding of this work to when I was a graduate student one summer. I took a course on 18th century French literature. A guest professor, this was at UNC a long time ago, a guest professor who I think has become a pretty big name in the field, taught the course. He was from University of Washington, I think. By now he's at Berkeley, I'm sure, or someplace. Anyway, wow. Okay, he was good. He was good. I don't even remember his name, but it doesn't matter. And I've developed some thoughts from his thoughts, but I owe him a lot of credit, I think. Okay, first, who is Voltaire? Voltaire is the great Enlightenment figure of the French Enlightenment, the great philosophe. Now, I lectured on the Enlightenment last week, and on the philosophes too. And I mentioned 4 most important ones, and Voltaire was among them. I'll tell you a little about his life. Middle class, good education, witty, wanted to become a famous dramatist, because that was one way to make money. He always resented the aristocracy, and this is pretty normal. Who doesn't? Who didn't anyway, especially in 18th century France. Because the aristocrats had some very unjust powers and privileges, and one was called a lettre de cachet. Une lettre de cachet is a letter with a stamp on it, and all that meant was, if I'm an aristocrat and if I think you have done something bad, I write a lettre de cachet about you, and the soldiers pick you up and put you in prison. For how long? How long do I want you to be there? Wow, this kind of unlimited power was, there were enough privileges like that were so unfair. Now, many aristocrats didn't use these unlimited powers, but some did. Voltaire twice was put into the Bastille, that political prison in Paris, which became the symbol of the French Revolution, because the French Revolution began on July 14th, 1789, when the Parisian mob attacked the Bastille. By that time, only 7 prisoners were found in there. So the scale of injustice was not so great, and probably there were never too many in there. But twice Voltaire had been in there and had been able to get out by the help of friends, and once by accepting to be banished from France. So he spent 2 or 3 years, I'm not sure, 2 or 3 years in England. This was when he was a young man. So, early in his career, he became a dramatist, and that meant writing poetic dramas. A couple of his dramas were successful, and so he made some money early. But he was witty and young, and again, very caustic, sarcastic, ironic. Voltaire was a wit. Voltaire embodies in many ways French wit, and I think I told this before, but just in case I didn't, one witty Frenchman says that in France everyone wants to be Voltaire. That is, he is the French wit incarnate. That would be a way to put it. Okay, so then in England, that changed his life, because England was so far ahead of France in terms of enlightenment. He read Locke on government, and Locke, this was in I need a date, 1730, let's say, 35 maybe. So Locke had already written about government and the rights of man and things like that. And England was a pretty free society in practice, and that affected Voltaire a lot. But it's not that he loved England, I think, and I'm not sure he even learned English very well. He learned it well enough, I guess. But I suspect that he loved the freedom that the British enjoyed, but he was envious, and it hurt him that France didn't have similar freedoms. Back to France he went, and his long career as a dramatist, and then he tried to be a scientist. He dabbled in science. He dabbled in philosophy. Tried to be serious about philosophy, and wasn't very good at it. But again, in my opinion, what he hits upon in Candide is more profound than any of the philosophers. It's just more profound than any of the philosophers, I think. Okay, then he gets in trouble again a little later, by 1750, let's say. He was born in 1709, I think, and he died in 1780. 85. I should have exact dates, but that's pretty close. I should check. I'll check when well, I was very wrong on Voltaire's dates. I'm embarrassed. I'm usually very accurate, or pretty accurate about dates, or a few years, but 1694, so, God, I was 14 years off. 1694, 1778. Let's remember, if I don't mention it later, the relation 1778, the French Revolution occurs 11 years later. So he died 11 years before that revolution, which he helped to create. He would never have been in favor of violent revolution. He and Rousseau, who were 2 of the 4 great philosophers, would never have been, in fact, none of the 4 would have been in favor of a violent revolution. But, oh well, back to Voltaire. So that makes it more realistic. He was in England, I thought I remember, 1729. In 1729 already he was 35 years old. Okay. Then, dabbling in science, dabbling in everything, starts to write for the Encyclopédie, which I told you about last week, the encyclopedia. always in trouble with the church, which he repeatedly attacked for its injustices. Remember that the partnership between the Catholic Church and the French monarchy, especially during the 18th century, really was scandalous. The 18th century I've described as the low point of religion, even theology certainly, of the past 15 centuries. It was not a time of glory for religion or for the church. The age of reason, after all, my God. But anyway, then came the 6 or 7 years that he spent with Frederick the Great, Frederick II, Frederick the Great of Prussia. Remember, I've already talked about this. Prussia in northern Germany, around Berlin and over into Poland, was the most powerful German state, but there were 300 German states. And that's very important. So there were a lot of little states, each of them trying to be, as Voltaire wittily said, Versailles, or each of these, the kings, or dukes or kings of these little states, wanted his little palace to be Versailles, and wanted to be the absolute monarch with absolute power, just like the French king had. Okay. At least in Prussia, Frederick treated him very well. Frederick spoke French well. It was French, you must remember, was the language of the royal courts of Europe. All the aristocrats, all the kings spoke French. And Voltaire was right. Everyone wanted to be like the French. Even when the French lost wars to England, the star of England was rising. The star of France was kind of setting. During the 17th and 18th centuries, everyone admired and respected the French language, French culture, French architecture, including French architecture, French food, French wine, French dress, everything, interior design, French. Okay, so Voltaire was very welcome in Prussia, but although he was treated quite well, he became, I think, restless and irritable, and Frederick tolerated a lot from him, I think. But partly, well, I'm not sure of this, so I won't say this, but anyway, in 1755 came a big event for Voltaire, and really pretty big. It was the earthquake of Lisbon, Portugal. Around 70,000 people, I think, died. A lot of people. I don't remember the exact number, but it was big. The earthquake was accompanied, I think, by tidal waves. I'm not sure. I used to know, but it doesn't matter to me. It was a cataclysm of serious proportion. Cataclysm, C-A-T-A-C-L-Y-S-M. Okay. And it struck Voltaire, like other people, in the same way as the Black Death, the plague of the 14th century, struck many people, as symbolically raising a huge question how can a loving, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God permit such occurrences, such a vast destruction of so many lives? It's hard to reconcile these two things, or it seems so to people. Now, I'd like to say a word about this in advance. This is called theodicy. Theodicy. Theodicy was a word invented in a book of that title by Leibniz. Leibniz was the greatest German philosopher of the first half of the 18th century, that is, when Voltaire was living. And Voltaire studied Leibniz. And Candide is, to a certain extent, a response to Leibniz. In Leibniz's book Theodicy, the word means justification of God, basically, or justice, justification of God. And the point is an attempt to rationally explain why God might permit evil. Okay. Leibniz's explanation is, I've never read it. I never want to read Leibniz, though great philosophers say that Leibniz is pretty great. He's a rationalist, but all philosophers are rationalists, really. They seek to explain rationally what existence. Anyway, in my own view, theodicy is a game that really it's a game. The believer won't play the game. A believer should not play the game of theodicy. For a believer to say, God, I'm going to figure out and explain why you do what you do, is absurd. The whole attempt is absurd. It's a blasphemy, in my opinion. If one believes, one thinks like this: death is. Of course, I'm going to die sometime. Everybody's going to die sometime. And it really doesn't matter all that much if we all die together or if we die separately. It's not really that big a deal. In other words, a theodicist is overly impressed by numbers and statistics in the first place. Absurd in itself, I think. What do numbers and statistics tell us? Faith in God should be faith in God. And so a theodicist is a person who is not, obviously an atheist does not play theodicy either. The atheist says there is no God, so the atheist doesn't play theodicy. The only people who play theodicy then are agnostics. And that's okay, but it is a silly game, because if one posits the existence of this omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, vast God, how can little man figure out what this vast God is doing? And Job is a response, in a sense, to all such inquiries. Where were you? Where were we when God created the mountains and the stars and the oceans and all nonsense? A good author, almost great, the author of Irrational Man, William Barrett, is one of my most important books that I've ever read. That doesn't make it great, maybe, but very influential. Says that theodicy is theology. Oh God, what's the expression? In extreme. The point is theology in desperate straits. That is theology confessing its bankruptcy. I like that. I think that's pretty good. Anyway, back to Voltaire. Voltaire was very struck by... Voltaire was an agnostic. He never became an atheist. And the famous story of his death, well, by then he was 78 and 84 years old, summoning the priest from Saint-Sulpice there in Paris to his bedside so that he could have the last rites before his death. This impresses lots of people. And then one looks at Hume, the great Scottish philosopher, really great philosopher, I think. Hume, who remained agnostic even to his deathbed, and a cheerful, good, kind man. Voltaire was a good man too, but that's regrettable, I think, this summoning the priest to his bedside. I mean, that's stooping to a game. That's God. It's like saying, God, I think that this priest has the power to change whatever verdict you have made on my life, might make about my life. So spray me with a little water, priest, mutter a few Latinisms, and this will change everything. Well, my view is a Protestant view, but it should be a Catholic view too, as far as I'm concerned. That's just too much nonsense. Okay, I'm sorry. Let's get to the book. Voltaire wrote this book then, Candide. He is said to have written it in 2 weeks. I'm not sure I believe that, but maybe. He wrote quickly. He was a historian too, by the way. It's arguable that he was the first good historian in Europe. He wrote a history of the reign of Louis XIV before anybody else wrote history, just about. Hume also wrote history, by the way. So these guys were very diverse in their intellect and curious about everything, and they deserve a lot of credit. Now, Candide. Candide. The name refers to the name of the main character, the hero. The name, we have the word candid in English. To be candid is to be frank. But in the French mind, to be frank, that is to always speak what one is saying, if that were possible, which of course it's not, would be to be a simpleton, naive, gullible. So we can take Candide, the name, to mean naive, gullible, innocent. Innocent, to be sure. Okay, relatively innocent. Okay, the story begins in Westphalia. At that time, this was one of the small duchies that Germany was divided into. Gyeongsang-bukdo, let's say. Maybe smaller. Smaller than Gyeongsang-bukdo, certainly. And the baron of this Westphalian, and Voltaire makes fun of German titles. The title goes on and on and on and on, all for this relatively small and unimportant state and baron. The baron had his castle, and Voltaire makes fun of that. Voltaire makes fun of everything, and he sometimes is very witty. Sometimes when he makes fun of the Germans, it's stupid. And there are chapters that I skip later in the book that I think are just plain. Voltaire being Voltaire, a waste, but still forgivable, pardonable, I think. Okay, Candide is, we don't know exactly, 18 to 20 years old, let's say. And he is the ward of the Baron and Baroness, meaning he's being raised in the family, but he's not a biological son. There had been a rumor that he had been the illegitimate son of the Baroness by some lackey, some servant, and Voltaire will make fun of things like that all the time. Anyway, the Baron and Baroness had a son and a daughter. The daughter's name is Cunégonde. Cunégonde, strange name, with possibly, I think, with definitely a sexual joke contained. Cunégonde is the same age as Candide, so they grew up almost like brother and sister. The other brother does not become important until a little later. Anyway, and in the family has a tutor, and the tutor is very important to me and to the book. Pangloss, Master Pangloss. Now, he is a philosopher, and he loves to philosophize, and he teaches basically Leibniz rationalism, Leibnizian philosophy. And Voltaire makes fun of this, and philosophers say that Voltaire simply didn't understand Leibniz, and that was probably true. But he understood some, and in the end he understood enough, I think. And I say that without knowing Leibniz myself. So I'm sorry about that, actually. According to Russell, Bertrand Russell, Leibniz was a great philosopher. And I respect Russell a lot. But it's not enough to make me read Leibniz, I think. Anyway, so Pangloss is philosophy, but first the word Pangloss. What was Voltaire getting at? Pan, everything. Gloss, tongue, because glossa is Greek for tongue, meaning he talks a lot. It at least means that. But we also have this word to gloss over, and the French have a similar word. To gloss over things is to paint over ugly things, to cover with a veneer, another good word, and as if to disguise things that are not very nice. If that's the case, then there's this secondary meaning. Pangloss also means to gloss over everything. Well, these two meanings are profound, and by the end of the book, really profound, I think. So let's follow this, and we'll be fine. Okay, at the beginning of the novel, we are introduced to all these people, and then one day, Cunegonde is walking out in the woods in the park, and she sees Pangloss performing some physical experiment, Voltaire very witty, on one of the maids, of the Duchess's maids. Well, performing the sexual act. Cunegonde is shocked and stunned, but she's also intrigued, and she can't get her mind out of it. She blushes and turns red. And so then, back in the castle, she finds herself suddenly behind a screen, one of those screens just like Oriental screens, stand up 6 feet high, with Candide. She drops her handkerchief. Candide, always the gentleman, blushing, picks it up. And suddenly they are kissing, and his hands are exploring her. All this happens very quickly. Just as suddenly the Baron arrives and kicks Candide out of his territory, out of his castle and territory, with great kicks dans le derrière. And this expression is used, ironically, 6 or 7 times throughout the book, and it's wonderful. But the point is, let's get the symbolism here. Symbolically, Candide is expelled from paradise. This is the expulsion. Now, how seriously does Voltaire play with this? A little seriously. But the parallel is striking. Excuse me. So, this relatively innocent young man is expelled for some original sin, sexual, which is an absurd interpretation of the doctrine, expelled from paradise, and he starts to wander. He cries, he weeps, he cries, he weeps. He's starving, and he wanders into a village. Now, around there are 2 small states where he has gone. He must have left Westphalian. And they're the Avars and the Bulgars. No reality. He wanders into town. He's almost starving. Passes an inn, and there a couple of guys who are recruiters. These were unscrupulous guys who found any way to get young men into the military, because they were paid for everyone they induced or forced into it. You look hungry, young man. They're winking at each other. Candide is the right size for a soldier, minimum size, at least, and he's a little well built. You look hungry. Let me treat you to some money, to some meal. Oh boy, let me treat you a little more. Candide, naive, has no idea what's going on. I can't pay for you this, but I'll pay you back. Oh, okay, just sign this. You're a soldier. Attention! Hit. Attention! Hit. He is beaten and beaten for 2 weeks until he understands the Bulgar style of attention, right face, left face, about face, forward march, all this military stuff. He becomes very good at it. He has to, because he is hit many times. Then suddenly there's a war, a big battle, and Voltaire satirizes war all the time, the absurdities. The Bulgars and the Avars, these cannons went off, and 15,000 young men were blown to bits. These cannons went off, and 15,000 of these guys were blown to bits. Then bayonet and all that. Candide is shocked and horrified and wanders off. Just his world has fallen apart. But meanwhile, this war had gone on, so that these soldiers had invaded the castle at Westphalian, destroyed the castle, raped the women, killed the men. The baron's dead. The baron's son is apparently dead. Pangloss was apparently dead too. I don't remember how he got off, but it doesn't matter. Cunegonde was being raped by some big soldier, and some captain came in, and attention, the soldier continued to rape Cunegonde, so the captain killed the soldier for disobeying him, and took Cunegonde as his personal mistress. All this we learn later, much later. As far as everybody's concerned, everybody's dead. Pangloss. Okay. Candide wanders off. He wanders and wanders. I left something out. He had tried to wander off earlier while he was being trained, but he was captured, and then he was forced to go to run the gamut, as it's called. 3,000 soldiers line up on two sides, and he, Pangloss, Candide, without a shirt, is supposed to run up and down there 50 times. Of course, no one can run down there more than once or twice at most, because the soldiers are there hitting him with big sticks. Well, his back is totally bloody, and finally he collapses. He makes it 1.5 times, but he's nursed back to health. He was going to be shot to death, but he was pardoned. Doesn't matter. Voltaire making fun of the absurdities of military life in the 18th century. Okay, this time Candide wanders off, and he wanders to Holland. Now, Holland was the mecca of religious tolerance, of enlightenment, of freedom. It was certainly the freest state in Europe for 100 years, 150 years. Holland was a pretty great place to be, and that's why the pilgrims had gone there, and people seeking religious freedom went there. But as the New World developed, many of them went to the New World as a better place than Holland. He wanders there. Various things happen to him, but a very good man, when Candide is starving to death, rescues him. He is James the Anabaptist, and he's the best human being in the book. And this is important. He's an Anabaptist. What's that? A person with odd views about baptism, let's say. They were hated by all the Europeans, murdered whenever anyone could get their hands on them, a persecuted lot, and he's the best human being in the book. In Holland, at least, he can live. So, and he's a merchant, he has some money, and he takes care of Candide and makes him his friend. One day they're wandering around, and they see a beggar. This man has lost one eye, part of his nose, all of his teeth, looks horrible. And James, the kind man that he is, gives him some money. And suddenly the man says, "Candide, don't you recognize me? It's Pangloss." Well, what has happened to Pangloss? Pangloss escaped from the massacre at the castle, but Pangloss has a severe case of syphilis. Syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease. Now, Voltaire is always making fun, and we always forget how badly disfigured Pangloss has become. I mean, part of his nose is gone, one of his eyes, all of his teeth. But these are the extreme consequences of syphilis. Anyway, James cures him of this, pays, and then James takes a trip. He's going to travel. Now the serious traveling begins. But remember, this is a book about travel. What Voltaire wants to do is cover the whole world. And he will cover the whole world. Because what he wants to say, I think what happens is, as he writes this book, very heat in passion. He begins to realize that he wants to make a big statement, and this statement grows and grows in this book. If he had revised the book and started all over again, it might have been even greater, but he might have ruined it too, I admit. But it's a clear book. It's clearly a book that the author himself did not understand at the beginning. I wonder how much he understands at the end, even. That's arrogant of me, perhaps, but I think it may be true. I had read the book several times before, once or twice anyway. I never would have seen what that professor taught me to see. And I wonder if Voltaire saw it. Anyway, you judge, and it doesn't matter. But I think in the heat of creation, this has happened often enough. Okay, back to our book. They travel from Holland by ship around to Lisbon. As they're approaching Lisbon, the great earthquake strikes. Huge destruction. The ship wins. The ship is destroyed almost, part of it anyway. And while our three men are standing there, James sees a sailor who is swept off the ship into the water. James leans over, of course, to help the man. The sailor pulls on James to try to get up, but in doing so pulls James into the water. Pays no attention to James. He only cares about himself. Now this is a key moment. Pangloss and Candide see this, and Pangloss and Candide wants to rescue James. Not only because James is a human being, but because James is such an excellent, saintly human being. Pangloss says, no, don't do it. And now I'll tell you what Pangloss teaches. Pangloss's teaching is that everything happens in this world for a reason. And his conclusion is everything happens in this world for the best reasons. The world could not be a better place because if some misfortune hadn't happened to me, I wouldn't be maybe here now. But this is a blessing. Therefore, whatever misfortune or bad thing happened to me, made it possible for me to be here. It happened for the best. Everything happens for the best in the best of all possible worlds. This is the best of all possible worlds. Well, this is the idea that Voltaire attacks in Candide. Because what he says, of course, in earthquakes and syphilis and terrible wars and terrible massacres of people, we've already seen a lot of them after all, already in the first 4 chapters. This is the best of all possible worlds? Well, that's too much nonsense, Voltaire says. Okay, so James is drowning. Candide wants to help him, but Pangloss says, no, everything's for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Well, this has some profound implications. At this point, the nonsense that the philosopher teaches becomes immoral, becomes evil, morally reprehensible, evil. Well, that's absurd. Not to help that man especially, his benefactor in addition, by reason of some strange, abstruse reasoning. Well, that's just too absurd. And we won't forget that moment because it's important. And so Pangloss, although he's a fool, he's an utter fool, his foolery has an immoral dimension. Okay. Pangloss and Candide both swim safely to shore. Only 3 people survive. Pangloss, Candide, and that sailor who was rescued by James and then ignored James. That wicked person, and Pangloss is pretty wicked too, but that guy is just an animal. He goes into town, Voltaire loves to say, and now the town is burning, dead bodies everywhere. He goes in, goes into the bar, the nearest bar, drinks all the wine he can, tries to find a woman. He is brute existence. his level on a he is human existence on a brute level. Okay, I've got to move on here. Now, the church in Lisbon, this disaster has happened, wants to find some scapegoat to blame for this. And thank you. So the church holds an auto da fe. That means basically the hanging or burning or torturing of heretics. Pangloss and Candide are going to find something to eat in all these ruins, and there is kind of a church spy who asked Pangloss questions about the religious questions. Pangloss gives the wrong answer. Even Candide gives a wrong answer. Both of them under arrest, put into prison. Pangloss is supposed to be burned, but it's raining a lot. So instead of burning him, they hang him. But the hangman hasn't had much practice at hanging people, so they hang him, but the knot doesn't work, and Pangloss only seems to be dead. Meanwhile, Candide, whose guilt is much less, is simply whipped and whipped and whipped almost to death. But as he's lying there, almost dying, he is rescued and taken to a room by an old woman. And this old woman is very important. She's just the old woman, la vieille. And he is taken to a room and nursed back to health by this old woman, who never says anything. And finally, within 2 weeks, by the way, one of the points that Voltaire seems to make about human beings, about us, is that we are resilient. Terrible things happen to us and we bounce back. We bounce right back. We're near death, we bounce back, and 2 weeks later we're almost the same people we were before. True, false, I don't know, but there is some truth in it, and it's part of the charm of the book. At least it's part of the charm of the book. Because after all, it's a book about terrible things, and the book is funny, witty. It is very witty. Famous for its wit, not for its profundity, but it's profound. Anyway, so he's nursed back to health, and then he's told he's going to find out who it is that's responsible. He is taken to an elegant room, just a beautiful room. It must be a very wealthy man who owns it, and suddenly in walks Cunegonde. My God, the love of his life, who he thought was dead. Whom he thought was dead. Pangloss thought she was dead. She had been, last he saw, she was being raped, and certainly dead. She's alive. People pop up again and again throughout the book who were presumably dead. She tells her story charmingly. She tells about how she was, in her version of the story, somehow she is still a virgin. And that's charming. And maybe she even thinks she's still a virgin. It's wonderful because they're so naive. But she's been around. After all, she was raped by the soldier, then she was the kept woman of the captain, until he got tired of her and thrown out then, and on and on and on. Somehow, though, she has become the mistress of the Grand Inquisitor, the top religious official of Lisbon. Well, that's a powerful guy. She's the mistress of the Grand Inquisitor. But she's also the mistress of a very rich Jew, a Jewish banker, and the Grand Inquisitor needs that Jew. And so they share her. 3 days and 4 days, and Saturday night at midnight is a key time. But she has been able to put both of them off sexually, and that makes both of them continue to be very interested in her. Well, the story is told with such charm. And at one point she's told about a wound that she got on her thigh. And Candide, naive, says, "Oh, I'd like to see your wound." Just innocent. And she says, "You will." So they're kind of unchanged by all their experience. They're unchanged by it. Have they learned anything? No, I don't think so. And that's an observation made by Voltaire in the book too. Do we learn much from our experience? No, probably not. Are we changed much by our experience? Not much. By the end of the book, Voltaire will make some observations, but for now, that's who we are. So, she tells her story. Then, at this time, it's 12 o'clock midnight Saturday. Oh, yes. In walks the Grand Inquisitor. The Grand Inquisitor says, "Who are you?" Pulls a sword. Candide pulls his sword, kills the Grand Inquisitor. There he is, dead. He has killed the Grand Inquisitor. Oh my God. This is terrible. I've killed the Grand Inquisitor. I'm dead. Just then, in walks the Jew, because of this confusion about time. He pulls his sword. Candide kills him too. Two dead bodies of two very important men right there. And Candide doesn't know what to do. Cunégonde doesn't know what to do. But the old woman, who is very sharp, she's one of the two sharpest people in the book, says, "We're out of here." Goes out, gets horses for them, and they ride. They ride all the way to Cadiz, which was in Spain at the time, but it was a port. They're going to the New World. But if it hadn't been for the quick-witted old woman, those two would still be standing there, or dead. Okay, they ride to Cadiz. Cunégonde has lots of jewels, but along the way they're robbed by a monk. Voltaire never misses an opportunity to mock the church, and especially monks, priests. They're all sexually active, they're all rascals and thieves, they're all swine, or homosexuals. Later. Very witty, but not kind to the church. They arrive at Cadiz with only a portion of their wealth. They get on a boat and they ride across the ocean. Now remember, we left Westphalian, we went to Holland, we went to Lisbon, we've gone to Cadiz, and now we're crossing the Atlantic Ocean to South America. And we will go all the way to the end of South America. Now, that's important because right now, during the ship voyage, Candide and Pangloss... Oh no, Pangloss is dead. As far as they're concerned, Pangloss is dead. Candide, Cunégonde, and the old woman are on the boat. And Candide says, "I don't understand it. Master Pangloss is dead, but his philosophy, I think, does not make sense. This world is a terrible place. The best of all possible worlds? I don't understand." And the old woman smiles and says, "Well, I don't think his philosophy is very true." She is a very sharp person of experience. She has learned from experience. And she says, in fact, "I think if you asked everyone on this boat to tell his or her story, you would find that almost every one of them has at some time wanted to kill himself. Some, many times, wanted to kill themselves." "Is it possible?" says Candide. "Is it possible?" says Cunégonde. "I think so." But she also makes another profound observation. She says, "Nevertheless, it's remarkable. I have met in my life," and she's been around, "only a few people," and then Voltaire becomes Voltaire, cute, absurd, silly people, "who have actually committed suicide, because I too have wanted to kill myself many times, but some absurd will in me makes me want to stay alive. It's one of the absurd things of humanity that we have this persistent desire to stay alive despite terrible things. Now, I haven't seen many terrible things in my life, unless you are old enough to have experienced the Korean War, or have experienced great adversity in your own personal life. Maybe you haven't either. But we have to remember the people who went through the Korean War, let's say, the people who went through World War II in Europe, in Asia, the terrible things that have happened in this world, a Jew in Germany during the Third Reich, a Russian during the Stalin era. Now, parenthetically, in parentheses, I'm paying a lot of respect to statistics, numbers, And I think that is a distortion of reality. Statistics are certainly a distortion of reality. But we tend to respect them, I know, and I certainly do too. But let's remember all this. The old woman's words are pretty profound. Okay, so they cross the ocean. They arrive at Buenos Aires in Argentina. They immediately go to... I missed something. When they went to Cadiz, to the port, the Spanish port, a regiment of soldiers was just leaving. Candide reports to them and says, I can do right face, left face and all that. And they think, wow, he's amazing. He's a captain. They make him a captain. He's an officer. Because he can do right face, left face, the way those Germans taught him to do it. Okay, he's a captain. That's how they are on the ship. So they have the comfortable crossing to Buenos Aires. He presents himself with Cunegonde and the old woman to the governor of Argentina. The governor is a womanizer. He sees Cunegonde, he wants her. The old woman can tell right away what's going on. She has seen it many times before. Candide understands nothing. So the governor says, go out and arrange things for the troops. You, stay here. Well, La Vieille, the old woman, goes to Candide and says, look, here are your choices. I think you better run. Because there's no way that you can have Cunegonde. She's going to stay here with him. And if you try to oppose the governor, you're dead. The best thing for you is to escape and run now. Candide's heart is broken. God, he's gotten her back and now he's going to lose her again. But he knows she's right. Now, along the way, mysteriously, another major character has appeared. His name is Cacambo. Cacambo is a young servant. Cacambo has been around. He is sharp. He is almost as sharp as the old woman is. And without him, Candide will be lost many times. Just as without the old woman, Cunegonde will be lost many times. Skipped something. Oh God, important. On the sea voyage, crossing, the old woman tells her story. It happens like this. Cunegonde, in the conversation, says to the old woman, well, you haven't been through anything. Have you been raped by the Bulgars? Have you been passed around, blah, 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 the Grand Inquisitor, blah, blah, blah. And the old woman says, girl, you are a child. You have seen nothing. I will now tell you my story. And her story, of course, is amazing. She was the daughter of a pope. Voltaire making fun of the church, as always. Are popes supposed to have daughters? She was the daughter of a pope, that is, richer than 50 dukes of Westphalian. She was raised with such luxury, such wealth, everything. And her mother was a princess, blah, 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 blah. Okay. At 18, she was supposed to get married to a very wealthy, very handsome young man. But the young man, an older woman was jealous of this. Probably the older woman had an affair with the young man, and so she was furious that he was going to get married. She poisoned him. He died in agonies. Everyone's always dying in agonies of poison, because several people are poisoned. Terrible way to die. But Voltaire makes fun of it. Anyway, so she's shocked by this, horrified. She decides to take a trip on the boat with her mother, a little pleasure trip to distract her from her grief. Pirates attack the boat, North African pirates. Kill the soldiers, take the women. Along the way back to North Africa, of course, they're raped many times. Our young princess, who was a virgin, raped many times before they even get back to Africa. raped a few more times there, but somehow escapes because of some civil war. Everybody kills everybody, but the young princess, who will be the old woman, somehow escapes. She's rescued by a eunuch, eunuch, sexually non-existent, who is so pained because he wishes he could rape her. She's sold into slavery, and here we go. She crosses. She is taken by the pirates to Morocco. This is a little important. We're getting more and more land involved in our drama here. And she, through her travels, passes on and on, somehow staying alive, to all across North Africa, to Egypt, all across Egypt to the Black Sea. At the Black Sea, she's a servant of somebody, alive somehow, no longer pretty, so no longer raped all the time. She is in a war there, and in that war, the Turkish soldiers are surrounded. There are 20 girls and 100 men, and they're surrounded, and they're going to be starved out. They're starving. And the question was, shall we starve or shall we... They decide to not kill people, but to cut off the buttock, the rear end, the posterior. In any case, the old woman lost one of her buttocks because they needed food. And so they cut off, but she survived. So she only has one buttock. And this is funny, but it's typical of the book, actually. It's terrible, but it's funny. And so the woman telling the story here has only one buttock. And she continues to wander and wander, and she reaches Moscow. And this is important for the book. That means the travels of the old woman have taken her all the way to Moscow, while the travels of Candide take him all the way to the far western coast of South America. Universality. Voltaire is aiming at universality here. He's making a statement not just about Europe or here or there, but everywhere. And that's kind of important. So she tells her story. She's telling her story to Candide and Cunegonde on the trip over to South America. Now, Candide has to leave Cunegonde for his life, and he has his new friend, his servant, Cacambo. They flee into the wilderness, and they arrive, Cacambo knows, they arrive in Paraguay. Now, Paraguay at this time was ruled by the Jesuits. Here we go. Jesuits. The Jesuits were the most powerful order of priests and monks in the Catholic Church in the 17th and 18th century. Their power was huge, and they were a militant order. They were soldiers. They were soldier priests. And they ruled large areas of the world, especially in South America. They ruled it. This was an order within the Catholic Church that, because of its power and influence, was able to rule lands. This made them the rivals of the King of Spain, for example, the King of Portugal, of course. Okay, so Cacambo knows that they will be safe if they go there, because Candide is a soldier. He's a captain. The Jesuits will be glad to get him. Okay, he is taken to the commandant, the head guy, a colonel, let's say, to have dinner, because the colonel is a German too. Here we go. They dine. They are treated very well. Gold, silver. He's like a king. They're speaking German to each other, but suddenly they look at each other and say, "Don't I know you?" This commandant is Cunegonde's brother, the boy, the son of the baron with whom Candide grew up. "But I thought you were dead." "Yes, I was dead," and he tells his story. The pattern of the book is everyone has stories to tell, and it's one of the joys of life to tell the stories, even of one's misfortunes. And this is Voltaire too. And I think it's kind of wise. The telling of our misfortunes is a great relief. It's almost a joy. And the listening to the stories is almost a joy too. No matter how horrible the stories are, almost. Because I'm alive, I'm healthy, I'm happy, or I'm alive at least here. And in retrospect, I share these experiences with you. Fascinating, wonderful stories. It's one of the aspects of our experience that Voltaire says. Now, my last words here. He is not saying, because where we're going is profound, he is not discrediting language itself, but maybe he is. But he certainly will discredit philosophizing and theologizing. That's the point that I'll leave you with for today.